From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America. Hello and welcome to Firstpost America, your global pit stop for the latest news and headlines from the United States and around the world. I'm Eric Ham coming to you live from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. We'll get you a roundup of all the day's top stories, but first, let's take a look at the headlines. Canada will halt all weapons shipments to Israel and calls for an independent Palestinian state. Now, Israel has slammed the move, saying history will judge Ottawa's actions harshly. France launches a major operation against drug trafficking ahead of the Olympics. Over 4,000 officers have been deployed and at least 100 arrested in the first raid. China sends a communication satellite to the dark side of the moon as Beijing's lunar exploration ambitions grow. South Korean and American troops launch combat drills, including tanks and heavy weaponry. This comes as North Korea conducts engine tests for a potential hypersonic missile. South Sudan closes all schools for 2 weeks amid an intense heat wave. Temperatures have soared over 113 degrees Fahrenheit. We begin right here in the United States, and it was a turbulent Tuesday as a contentious Texas immigration law went on a legal roller coaster. A federal appeals court has put a hold on a Texas immigration law which would allow state police to arrest and deport migrants who cross illegally into the United States from Mexico. The law, known as Senate Bill 4 or SB 4, has been strongly opposed by Democrats but was passed by the Republican majority in the Texas state legislature. Now, just last month, it was temporarily blocked by a federal judge, saying it was in conflict with key provisions of federal immigration law. However, earlier this month, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a temporary stay on SB 4, but the stay was lifted on Tuesday, allowing the law to actually take effect. Now, hours later, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals put the law back on hold. The court will continue hearing arguments on the issue today. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected an emergency application from the Biden administration, which says that the law is a clear violation of federal authority and would cause additional chaos. The nation's highest court of 6-3 conservative majority and the 3 liberal justices on the Supreme Court had dissented. Now, liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, Texas passed a law that directly regulates the entry and removal of non-citizens and explicitly instructs its state courts to disregard any ongoing federal immigration proceedings. That law upends the federal-state balance of power that has existed for over a century. Now, responding to the Supreme Court's decision, the White House said it would make Texas less safe, burden law enforcement, and sow chaos and confusion at the southern border. The decision also raised alarms among immigration activists. And there was also confusion on the ground about whether the law could actually be enforced.
It's not very easy to get this far but not make it to the US and to not send money to our families.
They should put their hand on their heart and act in favor of migrants because we have families just like they have families. We have to enter the United States. At least in my case, I am in political exile.
We came to work. We did not come to take anything from anyone. What we want is to work in the US, to send money to our children and to our families.
So far, Texas authorities have not announced any arrests made under the law, but the state has argued that it has a right to take action over what authorities have called an ongoing crisis at the southern border.
I think it passes constitutional muster. I think it's the right policy for the state of Texas. We have to have a secure border, and that's not just a Republican, ideal. That is independents, that is swing voters, that's even some Democrats who want a secure border. So SB 4 goes a long way to address that, and it should be the law in the state of Texas.
There's no argument for many of us in the Democratic Party from Texas or across the country that doesn't acknowledge that we need to address some issues along the border. We need to address those issues. President Biden and the administration worked in a bipartisan way with Senator Lankford to strike a deal on border security. That was sabotaged by former President Trump and his cronies in Congress. What we don't want is persons of color to be targeted for no other reason than the color of their skin.
Now, Texas Governor Greg Abbott praised the Supreme Court order and described the situation at the U.S. southern border as an invasion. Still, calling the law xenophobic, Mexico said it would not, under any circumstances, accept the return of any migrants to its territory from the state of Texas.
We are also at a critical moment with what the Supreme Court of United States has approved today. Yesterday it had put an impasse, but today it has approved the SB 4 law, which is an anti-immigrant, xenophobic, discriminatory law. So what are we doing? What can we do to address this negative narrative? I think the most important thing is to say that we have a human mobility strategy. Mexico has a unique model. There's no other country that is at the same time a country of origin, transit, destination and return. That's us.
De tránsito, de destino y de retorno.
Now, this legal showdown comes as the Biden administration and Republicans continue to clash on border policy. President Biden is under immense pressure to address immigration policy and reform, which is among the top issues at the center of the 2024 presidential election. Republicans blame Biden for the record flow of migrants into the United States, while the White House accuses Republicans of deliberately sabotaging a bipartisan attempt to find a solution. December 2023 saw more migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border than any other month on record. The U.S. Border Patrol recorded over 300,000 encounters with migrants also that month. However, that number dropped to almost half in January of 2024. And arrests for illegal crossings at the border were also at the highest in December of 2023. Border Patrol made nearly 250,000 arrests in December, the highest monthly tally on record. The arrests, however, fell by half in January to just over 124,000. Over 6.3 million migrants have been detained crossing into the United States illegally under the Biden administration, higher than under the last three presidential administrations. Now, the polls suggest that more than 2/3 of Americans disapprove of President Biden's handling of the issue. In recent weeks, the president has significantly stepped up his rhetoric on immigration, blasting his predecessor and 2024 rival Donald Trump on the issue. The political battle and legal back and forth on the immigration issue will only intensify as the election draws near. And shifting our focus to the Middle East, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken returns to the region. This is his 6th visit to the Middle East since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. And the visit comes as the fate of talks to secure a ceasefire and the release of hostages literally hangs in the balance. Blinken will first make a stop in Saudi Arabia's Jeddah, then he will meet Egyptian leaders in Cairo to discuss talks brokered by Egypt and Qatar, as well as efforts to get more aid into Gaza.
This is multifold. It's, of course, to push for an agreement on a ceasefire and the release of hostages. As you know, we're intensely engaged on that every single day, and we're doing everything we can to push that forward and to reach an agreement. But it is also to continue the conversations that we started back in January on exactly the question you raised, which is post-conflict Gaza and the arrangements that will need to be made to provide for its governance, for its security, for humanitarian assistance, for its redevelopment.
Now, talks on a potential ceasefire resumed in Qatar just this week. And on Monday, Israel's spy chief David Barnea joined talks with Egyptian and Qatari mediators. However, weeks of negotiations have not yielded an agreement between Israel and Hamas. And now Washington hopes to finalize a deal between the two sides and alleviate the humanitarian crisis that is gripping Gaza. The U.S. has repeatedly called on Israel to allow an increase in the flow of aid into the Palestinian enclave. Meanwhile, an Israeli delegation headed by its defense minister will be visiting Washington to discuss the Rafah operation. Now, according to reports, Washington will present alternative plans for how Israel can continue pursuing Hamas without launching a major ground offensive in Rafah. President Biden is pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to pull back from a full-scale ground operation in Rafah. Now, before heading to the Middle East, Secretary Blinken said he would pursue conversations on arrangements for governance, security, and redevelopment of post-war Gaza.
So impressed upon Israel the imperative of having a plan for Gaza for when the conflict ends, which we hope will be as soon as possible, consistent with Israel's needs to defend itself and make sure that October 7th can never happen again. There, as you know, we put out many months ago a number of principles in Tokyo regarding the future of Gaza. We stand by those principles, and the challenge now is to make sure that any plan for the future brings them to light. But that will be very much the focus of this visit.
On the ground, however, there is no sign that the war is in fact dissipating. Israeli troops are continuing their raid in Gaza's biggest hospital, Al-Shifa, which they allege Hamas is in fact using. The Israeli army says over 50 fighters were killed and around 300 suspects were taken into custody. And from the war in the Middle East to the war in Europe, Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to create a buffer zone inside Ukraine. The Kremlin says this will protect Russia from Ukrainian attacks. Ukraine says Russia's call for a buffer zone speaks of its intentions to expand the war as Putin's soldiers gain more ground in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Zelensky's troops desperately await vital aid from Western allies. Our next report takes you inside.
Russian troops continue with their onslaught in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin's forces are now advancing in the east. After the fall of Avdiivka, Russian soldiers have now captured more territory, and Putin now wants to create a buffer zone inside Ukraine. Putin says, and I quote, "A security zone would be difficult to penetrate using foreign-made assets." Basically, the buffer zone would make it difficult for Ukraine to launch attacks into Russia. Ukraine says that a buffer zone only means that Russia is preparing for a larger attack. The call for a buffer zone comes after two significant operations. The first was when anti-Putin forces launched a cross-border attack into Russia earlier this month. And second are the drone strikes that Kyiv carried out in Russia's Belgorod. Russia has announced that it will now evacuate 9,000 children from regions bordering Ukraine. Putin also said that his forces were ready for a much bigger operation this summer. Meanwhile, Zelensky's troops have been left to fend for themselves as aid from Western nations dries up. Pentagon's chief warns that Ukraine's survival is in danger.
So when we invest in Ukraine's security, we invest in our own security. And we strengthen this contact group's shared vision of an open world of rules and rights and responsibilities. Today, Ukraine's survival is in danger, and America's security is at risk. And they don't have a day to waste, and we don't have a day to spare either.
U.S. Defense Secretary Austin Lloyd added that Russia would not stop at just Ukraine.
And ladies and gentlemen, let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But as President Biden has said, Ukraine can stop Putin. if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Ukraine's survival is on the line, and all of our security is on the line. So we will continue to stand together to resist Putin's campaign of conquest, and we will continue to keep the faith with the people of Ukraine.
Lloyd Austin's comments come at a time when American lawmakers continue to block military aid for Ukraine. Republican House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson has refused to vote on a bill that would provide Kyiv $60 billion worth of aid. The Biden administration says it is working with lawmakers to break the deadlock. Meanwhile, Ukraine says the situation on the front line continues to deteriorate.
We have difficult situation on the front line because of lack of artillery ammunition. And we hope that this Czech initiative, which Luxembourg joined, will help us, and beginning since April we will have enough ammunition, artillery ammunition, to deter our front line. So now the front line is stabilized.
Russia continues to hold a massive advantage over Ukraine. Officials in Kyiv say Russia has carried out over 3,000 ground and air attacks since the year began. With no peace talks in sight, and with Russia holding on to large parts of Ukrainian territory comfortably, it looks like Putin is actively working towards a buffer zone.
And now we turn to the political turmoil unraveling in South Africa. The rift between current President Cyril Ramaphosa and former President Jacob Zuma continues to deepen. President Ramaphosa's ruling party, the African National Congress, or ANC, is suing the newly formed rival opposition party started by Zuma. The ANC is in fact taking Zuma's new party, also known as MK, to court. The ANC says that the MK did not meet the registration criteria in September of last year. South African parties were required to register last year in order to contest the May 29th general elections. However, Zuma's party was formed only recently after reports of a fallout with President Ramaphosa. Now, President Ramaphosa and former President Zuma were longtime members of the ANC. However, this year, things took a drastic turn when former President Jacob Zuma broke off from the ruling party. President Ramaphosa has called Zuma the most destructive person to South Africa's democracy. And now the ruling party plans to ban Zuma's party from contesting in the upcoming elections. The ANC has launched a legal campaign to deregister and disqualify this new party. Meanwhile, leaders from Zuma's party say they will launch a civil war if in fact they are disqualified. The African National Congress has ruled South Africa for nearly 3 decades. But latest polls show that President Ramaphosa's party is actually decreasing in popularity. Meanwhile, the MK party has gained traction because of former President Jacob Zuma. In fact, it is now the 3rd most popular political party in South Africa. Meanwhile, the ANC has denied that the legal action is a reaction to the political threat posed by Zuma and the MK. The ruling party has also ruled out a coalition with Zuma's other rivals.
If you know what South Africa has gone through, coalitions will not work unless those coalitions are regularized. We have seen how nations that are administered through coalition governments also battle in terms of policy contradictions. And therefore, out of those lessons, our immediate bet is to win elections.
Now the ANC is facing anti-incumbency as South Africa struggles with years of stagflation and rising unemployment. Will voters retain their trust in the African National Congress, or will former President Jacob Zuma's MK party play spoiler? One thing that is certain, uncertainty abounds. And finally to Brazil, where former President Jair Bolsonaro has been accused of forging his COVID vaccination certificate. The 68-year-old former leader has been formally indicted. And this as the Brazilian police filed an investigation report naming Bolsonaro and 16 of his subordinates for falsely entering data into the public health system. Our next report breaks it all down for you.
Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's legal troubles are spiraling up. The 68-year-old leader has now been formally indicted for faking his COVID vaccine certificate. According to a report filed by the Brazil police, Bolsonaro and 16 others plotted to issue false certificates. They reportedly used those certificates to do away with the restrictions amid a raging pandemic. The report names the former president along with his subordinates. That includes a doctor, a lawyer, health officials, and soldiers, among others. The police investigation shows that one of Bolsonaro's close aides, an army colonel, confessed to entering fake data into the public health system. The colonel reportedly said Bolsonaro ordered him to insert the false data for him and his daughter. He further said that those certificates were printed and delivered to the former president. According to Brazil's Public Health Department records, the former president received the vaccine in Sao Paulo during the pandemic. But an investigation later found he was not in the city at the time. The Brazil police are investigating charges of criminal association and insertion of false data into the public system. According to Brazilian laws, both these offences are punishable with imprisonment. Bolsonaro has been widely criticized for his management of the COVID-19 pandemic. The former president had dismissed the severity of the pandemic. He not only vehemently opposed a lockdown to curb the virus, but also asked Brazilians to stop whining as the death toll reached record highs. He even joked about the vaccine, saying that it could turn you into an alligator. Bolsonaro, a COVID skeptic, had publicly vowed to never get the COVID vaccine. He has denied any knowledge of records being tampered with and says that the case against him is fabricated.
If I'm out of the political game, I will be a citizen, maybe a good political facilitator. There are many good names, but I believe until the last second, without exemption in a fair trial or any kind of revenge on the part of the TSE.
The Brazil authorities in January confirmed that his COVID vaccination certificate was forged. However, they didn't have enough evidence to access who had forged the data. This isn't the only legal battle that Bolsonaro faces. There are plenty of them. He's facing an investigation into an alleged coup plot to stay in power after losing the 2022 general election. Thousands of his supporters had stormed government buildings, including the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress. They looted and vandalized the buildings. Bolsonaro has been barred from running for office for 8 years for undermining the electoral system. Last month, he had to surrender his passport. The former president is also being probed over the alleged misappropriation of state gifts. For now, Brazil's Attorney General will decide whether to charge the former president or not. The indictment in the false COVID vaccination certificate case is a first for the embattled far-right leader, but it could open the floodgates of trouble for Jair Bolsonaro.
That's our show for today. We certainly thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you right back here again tomorrow. Thanks again for watching. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America.